Hello again, friends, and welcome. When I was in grade school, I once got in trouble for sneaking off the school property at lunchtime to go to the neighborhood candy store. Now, as background, I was warned several times by my mother not to go to this particular store during school hours. Well, I got caught, brought to the principal's office, and sent home with a note. And when I presented my mother with this note from the teacher, which revealed my crime, I witnessed this very painful look of frustration on her face. And then she said to me, "How many times do I have to repeat myself?" And I thought to myself, as preparing for this week's gospel, the road to Emmaus, that must have been how Jesus felt and what he felt like saying when he encountered the disciples on the road to Emmaus, which I said is this Sunday's gospel. He must have been very frustrated with them. So to see that more deeply, why don't we listen to the text of this week's gospel, this Sunday's gospel, and then we'll go back and we'll look at some specific lines in the gospel and kind of analyze what those lines mean. This gospel is taken from Luke chapter 24. That very day, the first day of the week, two of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus. And they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were walking and conversing and debating, Jesus drew near them and walked with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing along the way as you walk along?" They stopped and they looked downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place these days?" And he replied to them, "Well, what sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in word and deed, before God and all the people. But our chief priests and rulers handed him over to a sentence of death, and they crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all of this, it is now the third day since this took place, and some of the women from our group have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and they did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are! How slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke! Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave them the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in and he stayed with them. And it happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem. There they found to gather together the 11 and those who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord. So now, friends, when we go back and take this gospel apart and look at specific lines, certain messages jump out at us and things become a little more clear. In the beginning, the gospel points out that it was the first day of the week. Well, it was Easter Sunday. It was late in the afternoon on the day of the resurrection. And they had heard all of these things. The women came to them and said that Jesus' body was gone. They had seen angels, and they were bewildered. The next thing we see is that they were walking away from Jerusalem. They were 7 miles away from Jerusalem. Now, the number 7 is important. In Scripture, 7 often means completeness. God created the world in 7 days. It means completeness. So what this means is that these disciples had given up. Jesus was crucified. They were now afraid that the same thing was going to happen to them. They had given up on everything that he had taught them for 3 years, and they were going away from Jerusalem. Why? Why is Jerusalem important? Because that's where Jesus went to bring us salvation. That's where he went to the cross. And now they're moving away from the cross. They're moving away from all of this. And they're going back to their old way of life. When Jesus finally shows up, the gospel points out that their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. Well, what does that mean? It means they had a closed mind, and their closed mind closed their hearts. They didn't understand who Jesus was. Apparently, they didn't understand a lot of his teachings for 3 years. And that closed-mindedness, the closed heart, that creates spiritual blindness. So now Jesus encounters these disciples, and he gets frustrated. And he says, "How foolish you are." Especially when he hears them say that they were hoping that Jesus was the one who would redeem Israel. What they were talking about is that they hoped that Jesus was a political Messiah that was going to defeat the Romans. They completely missed the message of love, of salvation, of redemption. And Jesus becomes frustrated with this. But what does Jesus do? He does express his frustration, but then what does he do? Jesus celebrates the Mass. He celebrates the Mass with these disciples. And that's how they're going to get to know him. Well, how do we know that? Because the first thing that Jesus does is the liturgy of the Word. He explains to them all of Scripture, everything in Scripture that pointed back to him. That's the liturgy of the Word. That was the beginning of Mass. Now they get to their home. And they ask Jesus to stay, and he does stay, and he reclines at table with them, and he breaks the bread, he says the blessing, and he gives it to them. Well, what's that? That's the liturgy of the Eucharist. First, he explains all about salvation history and everything that related to him in the liturgy of the Word, and then he breaks bread and shares that with them in the liturgy of the Eucharist. And upon receiving the Eucharist, their eyes are opened and they recognize him. They are becoming who they are called to be through the reception of the Eucharist. Well, why did Jesus vanish? He vanished because he continued to live on in them. Through the Eucharist, they came to recognize him, and they internalized him, and now he lives in their heart, in their soul, in their very being. Well, if he lives through them, then there is no need for him to physically appear to them anymore. Because now he lives in them, and then they are going to share that with everyone else. They go back to the disciples, and they tell the disciples everything that Jesus told them and how their hearts were burning. And it says they recount everything that had taken place on the way. And that phrase, on the way, became very famous, and they talked about early Christians as following the way. Well, what's the way? It's the way of Jesus. It's following his teaching. And then they were excited, and they told the disciples how they came to know him in the breaking of the bread. Jesus reveals himself to us in many ways, but not so much as he does when he reveals himself to us in the Eucharist. And when he does that, he opens our hearts, he opens our minds to what it really means to be a disciple of Christ. And then others come to recognize Jesus through us. Friends, during this time of pandemic, we've all been called to a new way of life in terms of how we shop, how we work, and how we interact with each other. But remember, God always brings good out of a bad situation, and perhaps this gospel is a reminder of a new way of life to which we are being called. Or maybe it's a way of life that's not really new at all. Perhaps it's a way of life that's just been forgotten. It's the way of love, expressed by slowing down, by praying more, by spending time contacting friends and relatives and family members that we haven't heard from in a long time, spending time with each other at a meal. You see, pandemics don't last. But as St. Paul tells us, love endures. Now is the time for us to turn back from our self-centered way and to turn toward what truly matters: love of God and love for each other. Until next time, may God bless you.